In the last part of this lecture, in part one, we had considered a definition of poverty as well as the measurement of poverty. In this section, we look at the broader policy context, and we look at this issue of poverty and dependency and how to address both simultaneously. And so historically, that's been the challenge. It's much more feasible, I think, to think about one issue at a time and to try to address one at a time, but we've tried to address both issues simultaneously. That's the conundrum. And so the mechanism that we've used historically to address both simultaneously is called the earnings disregard. And so in this lecture, I'll explain to you how the earnings disregard works. But to start off, in terms of poverty, so if all we wanted to do was simply eliminate poverty, we could do so at a cost of about $50 billion to the government. And I'm getting my numbers from the 2004 Green Book. These are 2002 estimates. But what we would need to do is fill the poverty gap for different age groups. So the estimate that I have there is $8 billion. $8 billion is the gap between the poverty thresholds and the amount of income that people hold. That's what the poverty gap is. It's an $8 billion gap for seniors. It's a $20 billion gap for kids, and then $22 billion for the working age population. And so if we add that up, that's a total gap of $50 billion. So if we simply provided cash grants in the amount of $50 billion, we could bring everyone up to the poverty level. And so we would address poverty in that manner. If our primary policy concern is that of dependency, if all we wanted to address was dependency, we could certainly do so. We could do so simply by eliminating all government programs, and so everyone would be left to fend for themselves. There would be no government assistance, and people would be entirely independent of the government. So we could address a dependency in that manner. But if our concern is with addressing both issues simultaneously, both poverty and the work effort simultaneously, that's much more a daunting task, and we've resorted to something called the earnings disregard. And so I'll explain to you exactly how this earnings disregard works. So we had talked before about the poverty thresholds, and we said that we mentioned that the poverty threshold for family of three is approximately $18,000. So I think it's easier to work in monthly amounts. So on a monthly basis, that would be about $1,500. To bring a family of three up to the poverty line, we're talking about $1,500 there. But what about the family that earns $1,000? So this is just sort of a hypothetical experiment. If you consider a family that makes $1,000, then if we're trying to address poverty, we would need $500 in the way of a government grant to bring that family up to the thresholds that we set. We've said that $1,500 is the minimum, and so you have a $500 gap for that family. So that's how we would address the poverty gap. So consider three different scenarios. If we look into this logic a little bit more, consider three different scenarios. You have one family of three that makes nothing. For whatever reason, they weren't able to find employment or whatnot, and so they have no gross earnings. So in terms of cost to the government, it would cost the government about $1,500 to bring that family up to the safety net level, the threshold level that we've set. That's the first family. Consider a second family. This family we just talked about. This family makes $1,000 a month. There's still a gap between what that family makes and what we've determined to be the poverty line. And so we would need a government grant of $500 to address poverty for this family. And then assume a third hypothetical family. This family makes $1,500 or more. And so the government would not be required to do anything in this instance. This family is already at the poverty line. We could address poverty in that manner, but if we're trying to address the work effort, the families that we're helping, we don't know what would happen in the way of efficiency or the work effort, and so we use an earnings disregard to promote work as a work incentive, in other words. And so recall the three family types. We have the first family that earns nothing. We would give that family, hypothetically speaking, under this hypothetical program, we would give that family $1,500. So the total take-home pay for that first family would be $1,500. Now recall the second family that started out with $1,000 of gross earnings. At this point, we're gonna take into account the earnings disregard. The earnings disregard, like I said, is intended to provide a boost for this working family. It's an incentive to work, and so we're going to literally disregard 50% of this what this family makes for grant calculation purposes. So if we disregard 50% of this family's gross earnings, the disregard amount is $500. 50% of $1,000 is $500, which leaves this family with $500. We're only going to count $500 of this family's gross earnings for grant calculation purposes. And so recall that the maximum grant amount is $1,500. We're going to subtract the countable earnings. $500 is the countable earnings amount from the maximum grant amount. And so we're left with the grant amount. So this family is entitled to $1,000 in the way of a grant by virtue of the fact that we've disregarded 50% of this family's gross earnings. Right? And so if we're considering how much in the way of total take-home pay this family is entitled to, this family started out by making $1,000, wasn't able to make ends meet, is still not at the poverty threshold, and so we give this family a boost in the way of an earnings disregard. And so the total take-home pay for this family is gross earnings, and we're going to add the grant amount. And so this family has been given a boost and is at $2,000. So instead of just bringing this family up to $1,500, the minimum, the threshold amount, we've given this family a boost, and this family has total take-home pay of $2,000. Consider another example. We're going to continue to assume a 50% disregard. I use the 50% disregard because it's easier to calculate. Not all programs use a 50% disregard. Our welfare system historically used a 33 1/3 disregard, basically a 33% disregard, but we'll use a 50% disregard for now. So assume that this family makes $1,200. This family has gross earnings of $1,200. And we're going to use the same amount of disregard, 50% disregard. We'll pretend that this family doesn't make 50% of what their gross earnings is. And so we're going to disregard 50% of $1,200, which is $600, leaving $600 of countable earnings. This is the earnings amount that we'll use to calculate the grant that this family is entitled to. And so the countable earnings will be subtracted from the maximum grant amount. Recall that we're guaranteeing everyone up to $1,500. That's the threshold that we've established, the maximum grant amount. $1,500 minus the countable earnings will yield the grant amount. And so this family that started out with $1,200 by virtue of the earnings disregard will be entitled to a $900 grant amount. That's the grant amount, and so if we're considering the total take-home pay for this family, the family started out with $1,200. And we're going to tack on this government grant in the amount of $900. And so this family's total take-home pay is going to be $2,100. The family, we just looked at a family that earned $1,000. Their take-home pay was $2,000. This family's take-home pay is going to be $2,100. This is exercise number 2 in your slides. But now we assume a family that earns $1,600 in the way of gross earnings, and we're once again going to assume a 50% disregard. Now this family that starts out with $1,600 in gross earnings, the first step is we're going to think about what this family is entitled to in the way of a disregard. How much will we disregard? We disregard 50%. So 50% of gross earnings is, clearly it's $800 here. So the amount of the disregard is $800. That's a 50% disregard. And so we're left with countable earnings. In other words, the amount of earnings that we're going to consider in calculating the grant for this family is 800. Right? So that's the countable earnings. And so to figure the amount of the government grant for this family, once again, we have a maximum grant of $1,500 minus the countable earnings. The earnings that we take into account when calculating the grant is 800. So we're left with a grant amount of $700 for this family that started out with $1,600. So the last step, we're thinking about the total take-home pay for this family. This family started out with $1,600. We gave them a grant of $700. And so if we add those amounts, this family has a total take-home pay of $2,300. And so those are the answers to exercise number 2 in your slides, if you want to check that later. But do we have a problem? We just decided to give this family that earned $1,600 a grant. This family was over the threshold amount of $1,500, but we decided to give this family a grant anyway. What if, hypothetically speaking, we stopped giving grants right at that threshold amount of $1,500? Well, you would end up with something called a cliff effect. And let me show you how that works. So we're going to cut everyone off at $1,500. We're not going to provide any sort of grant if they make up to $1,500. So that person who makes $1,499, right? You have a person who makes $1,499 is entitled to 50% disregard, and so the amount of the disregard for this family is going to be $749.50, and countable earnings is also $749.50. If we subtract that amount, if we subtract the countable earnings amount from the maximum grant amount, we're left with the government grant for this family of $750.50. Right, so that's the government grant amount that this family would be entitled to up to this threshold of $1,500. But the family that earns one additional dollar, the family that earns exactly $1,500 would receive nothing from the government because we've cut people off. So by earning that one additional dollar, the grant amount goes from $750.50 to nothing, just for earning that one additional dollar. So that's the cliff effect that we would have if we simply cut people off right at the threshold. So we're left with another conundrum. Do we let people exceed the thresholds, or do we cut people off at the thresholds? Those are a couple of different options that we're left with. And so in terms of program construction, most of our programs, we allow people to go above these threshold amounts. If you're looking at a program like supplemental security income, people are allowed to make more than the maximum benefit amounts. EITC, another example, you have these phase outs, so we don't have a large cliff effect. So in terms of the two options, we've decided to side with allowing people to exceed the thresholds as a matter of policy in the US. And so if you have any questions at this point, once again, I would encourage you guys all to come to the review session